Good morning, everyone, and welcome to this COVIDSafe legal compliance session run by Kaizen Synergy Law Firm. My name is Nihal, Samara. I'm the General Counsel and Legal Director here at Kaizen Synergy Law Firm, and I'd like to welcome you all to today's session. Today's session focuses on the COVIDSafe HR workplace laws and vaccination registers. And we're going to be looking at key items that your agency needs to be across. We're going to unpack some of the frequently asked questions that people ask us as well too, and look at really what your agency needs to consider and actually be aware about. Now, just by way of introduction as well too, really this whole COVID pandemic is raising just so many questions for agencies. And with it, what we are seeing across this is essentially a view of the challenges that agencies do and are facing. So some of the works that we have done, and currently we're working with the Shepparton group, Rumballara Aboriginal Cooperative up in Shepparton, and some of the works, just to give you an idea of our basic skill sets, is to look at setting up things like COVID testing services. We're working with them on vaccination, clinics, personnel, legal agreements, looking at the service coordination plans and clinical governance frameworks for their pandemic works. That includes health promotion, media releases, risk management plans, staff vaccination and mandatory reporting, which we're going to be talking about today, as well as daily attestation forms via the Gemba 360 dashboard. So you can see from a compliance point of view and pandemic point of view, our agency, our law firm, is actually right across the space in terms of the COVID compliance and rules that agencies need to follow. And that's some of just the basic work that I'm going to say we've even done literally in the last just 3 weeks, let alone what's gone back to February. With it, I am just getting some questions on the sound quality. Give me 1 minute and we're going to adjust this. There we go. That should be a lot better, I believe, now as well too. Thank you to Dorrit and Catherine who raised that with us. I gather the sound quality has now changed as well too. Great. Thank you, Catherine, and thank you for Belinda for confirming that. Let me just repeat just to make sure that we've got this all lined up as well too. So essentially our topic that we're going to be covering off today is around the COVID-safe HR workplace laws and vaccination registers. With this, some of our works that we've got, especially in the last few weeks, has been to work with the Shepparton Rumballara Aboriginal Cooperative, particularly around setting up their COVID testing service that needed to be done last weekend. We're now looking at their COVID vaccination and expanding their COVID vaccination clinics. Of course, across that covers things like service coordination plans, clinical governance roles, health promotion works, media releases, risk management plans, as well as looking at staffing, vaccinations, and mandatory reporting for things like their aged care facility and general staff as well. So we've been running these COVID legal compliance webinars since February 2020, last year. And as rules and regulations change, trying to keep agencies like yourselves up to date. So that really sets the frame in just some of the works that we've actually done literally in the last 2-week period, and will continue as well too. That said, it puts us really into a position of looking at, well, what are some of the HR laws? These cover and cut across fair work. They're cut across pandemic and public health guidelines and rules. They cut across operational guidelines and awards, as well as privacy and other issues that agencies are now having to consider as part of this process. So with it, as always, we'd like to pay our respects to the elders past and present upon the lands on which we all meet. While this session is being run by webinar, we do pay our respects to the traditional owners accordingly from where you all join us today. So today's webinar and topics are going to cover what are the rules. We're going to unpack these with you. We're going to look at not just legal theory here. I'm going to say for a blunt way, regurgitate what the fair work laws say or what safe work laws say, but we're going to unpack some of the challenges and issues that agencies have approached us on in implementing these as well too. So we're going to look at what if and answer some of the questions like, what if some of your employees don't want to be vaccinated? What do you do? What if all of the support workers want to be vaccinated, but one person doesn't? What impact does that have on your agency? What if you have volunteers that need to be vaccinated, because they provide support work like driving buses and all this sort of stuff? What do you do in terms of collecting, or can you even collect vaccination information about your staff? What impact and indemnity cover do you need to have? All of these types of issues is what agencies out there, like yourselves, are just trying to get answered. And today we're going to answer many of these questions. I'm more than happy, as many of you have seen over the past, I'm going to say almost 15 to 16 months now, since February last year, to answer questions after each of the webinars. These webinars are being recorded as well too, so that you will actually get copies of all of this information along with the resources that I'm using, including the slides, will also be sent out to you. So what is framing this conversation, first of all, is around the Australian COVID-19 vaccination policy document. And it does provide some guidance in terms of where the Commonwealth and state governments are heading. The unfortunate part that we actually put up back in January this year, and this is a few slides since then, was that lockdowns were to be or are to be a part of the Australian way of life until essentially vaccination rates and the percentage of the population is vaccinated. This was something that came out of the Australian Doctor newspaper some months ago. We are finding that, obviously, and this was well before the lockdowns occurred in Queensland, New South Wales and Victoria, that lockdowns are a tool that is essentially being used right across all state governments in terms of a tool that they're trying to use to some degree as well. So by attending this webinar, essentially you should get a better understanding of what the COVID rules are, improve your awareness of what the HR rules are for your agency. You'll get a collection of resources, as I said, including a recording of this webinar, along with the slides that we use and other resource information in our during this session as well too. This document that I can see Lena has also just raised a question, is that the COVID policy document isn't listed in your disaster plan as yet, and I'll just show you what the disaster plan are for those agencies that are joining us new. It is a reference document only. There are other documents, Lena, that we will also be placing in to your disaster plan to allow you to view reference information around it, and it'll be something else that is a lot more timely in terms of and relevant to your reference documents itself too. For those of you that are joining us for the first time and are new clients of ours as well too, what Lena had just been in asking the question of in terms of the disaster plan is that when you log into your Gemba dashboard, you will see the disaster or pandemic module, which is located right here in the middle of the screen. You will get a log in to this dashboard as well too. Once you log in, this is the Gemba dashboard. It will take you into your Gemba compliance platform. You can access your pandemic workplace plan by clicking on the disaster system and going into here, which will essentially run through all of the relevant documents and information that I'm talking about today as well too. We will revisit this as well too when we're looking at the HR system as well too, that agencies are also using as part of their COVIDSafe response. As I've mentioned, this webinar is being recorded all the way up to the Q&A part of the session. You can ask questions in the chat group, as a number of people have done, and I do thank Dorrit, Catherine, Belinda, and Lena, who've started this as well too. And if you do have any questions as we go through, please raise those in the chat group as well too. Anything that is not raised during the session, we will, as I mentioned, stop the recording and answer all of the questions before we finish up as well too. This webinar is being published on the Gemba 360 YouTube channel as well too, and also on our website as well, because it is a public, open, legal session that we are running. These sessions, as I mentioned, because you can visit the YouTube channel and actually visit all of the past sessions that we have run since February this year, particularly in relation to the COVID pandemic response and legal compliance issues that agencies have. Our contact numbers are also listed here. So if you do have any questions after today's session, by all means, reach out to us on 1300 360 360. And my mobile phone number has also been made available since February last year publicly as well. We will be covering off, and I will come back to this in terms of the registers and the vaccination registers. This is something we will also cover off in next week's session. But essentially, in terms of where we are going to head, it is important that you look at your HR registers for information in terms of documenting discussions and information and decisions around your COVIDSafe HR workplace requirements. So let's have a look at where we are heading and jump into some of these legal questions that you have all joined us today. A few other people have asked around unpacking some of their other HR questions. More than happy, post them in the questions chat group, and we will come to these as we go through it. So let's have a look at the COVIDSafe HR workplace laws and vaccination rules. So jumping straight in, employers and employees are seeking clarification on their workplace rights and obligations, particularly as now the COVID-19 vaccines become available in Australia, and more groups of our population are having access to the vaccines. There are some laws and public health orders in Australia that have been rolled out. These obviously cover places like aged care services and quarantine hotels, and we will summarise some of these for you as well too. But what we are seeing is that while that might cover aged care and certain industry groups, it isn't as clear as what agencies like yourselves actually need. So often people in HR roles, like people in culture roles or CEOs, will contact me and ask me for, well, where on earth is the line in the sand, and how do we actually go about this? Do we make mandatory, do we set up a policy for mandatory vaccinations? What do we ask staff? Can we collect information on whether they've had the vaccine? What are work health and safety requirements? And, if someone doesn't have a vaccine, but other staff do we need to tell people about it? What's our risk? All these types of things is what people are asking. So irrespective of what some of the laws and public health orders are, it's actually causing significantly more confusion around what the expectations of agencies and also individual liabilities are as well. So if I was to summarise some of these down, essentially on the 28th of June, National Cabinet
agreed that vaccinations are to be mandated for residential aged care workers as a condition of working in an aged care facility through shared state, territory and Commonwealth authorities as well. But even on that, we had questions coming out back in June. Well, what is the definition of a residential aged care worker? Does that include your contractors? Does that include staff? Does that include volunteers that are providing services? Are volunteers part of the aged care group and the likes? And I'll come to that in the next few slides as well. In Queensland, they've issued a public health direction for healthcare workers working with diagnosed cases of COVID-19. In WA, has issued a public health direction for quarantine centre workers, and New South Wales has issued a public health direction for airport and quarantine workers. So where does that then leave agencies? So essentially what we are seeing, and let me just bring this up, is that we've also heard that, and you would have seen this on the news, that places like SBC and Qantas and Virgin are setting up their own mandatory policies. And this all sounds well and good, but for community service organisations, we've had agencies contact us in the last few days saying, hang on, airlines are setting up mandatory vaccination policies, and that's what's been reported. But how does that actually work? We're a community service organisation, or we're working in a health service or a women's refuge service, or we're doing outreach workers to migrant resource centres. What do we actually need to consider? And we've actually unpacked this with agencies as people have actually called up. So essentially, while there are some laws around Australia, it is causing confusion. There are, however, limited circumstances where an employer like yourselves can actually require employees to be vaccinated. Now, I'm going to go through this with you as well too, but essentially, before we do that, you can look at whether there is a specific law that covers your industry specific sector, whether there's anything under enterprise or award agreements, whether there's current things in your current employment contracts. And back in, I will say, for those agencies we've been working with since February, really last year or before, we've started to put in policies, we've started to put in contracts, we've started to put in COVIDSafe work plans that started to engage a lot of staff well before where we are now to discuss things like mandatory vaccination policies, and got them starting to think about those some months ago around this. Also looking at if there is no law or agreement or contract that requires vaccination, whether you can be covered by this. Now, the first thing that agencies, and I know that you're all looking at, is can I have a mandatory vaccination policy, and what does that in fact look like? Now, let me cover this off first, and then we're going to go back over the HR rules. So essentially, what some factors you should consider really on an ongoing basis. And what I've said to agencies is, yes, mandatory vaccination policies can be used, but it is essentially and thank you, Kimberly's just asked, would these examples refer to volunteers as well as paid employees as well too? Yes, Kimberly, that is the case as well, and I'll unpack that with you as well too. It's a really great question. So just repeating that, Kimberly's just asked, would these examples refer to volunteers as well as paid employees? Yeah, and let me come to that for you as well. So some factors that you really should consider on an ongoing basis include the following. Now, I say ongoing basis because there are some parts of this that you might find, if we go back in time a few months ago, that may not have actually applied to your agency. But as things start to unfold, your agency may be brought into scope around this. Now, this checklist, essentially, we've taken directly from the Work Health and Safety website around this, Work Health and Safety, the Safe Work website, sorry, around work health and safety duties. And I'm going to talk over the top of these indicators that Safe Work have come up with. So running through these, Safe Work Go is the Australian Health Protection Principal Committee, the AHPPC, recommending COVID-19 vaccinations for all workers in your industry. We'll look at what this looks like in the next slide. But essentially, is there an industry-specific focus that the AHPPC have directed you on? Okay. If your workers, will your workers be exposed to the risk of infection as part of their work? So yes, obviously quarantine workers, meat packaging could be one as well too, but it actually broadens the net out of obviously health and community services, disability services, obviously vulnerable groups like Aboriginal community controlled orgs as well too would all be part of this group, for example, and this is examples of what Safe Work have given. The next one is, do your workers work with people who would be vulnerable to severe disease if they contract COVID-19? So again, some agencies like cancer respite services as well too could fall into this. Also, agencies that provide services to people with a disability as well too. The other question is, what is the likelihood that COVID-19 could spread in your workplace as well too? I.e., if people are working in close proximity to each other as well too. Do your workers interact with a large number of people in the course of their work that could contribute to a super spreading event if your workers contract COVID-19? Someone's just asked, what happens if, do I need to meet all of these requirements or is one enough? And great question. Generally, we say the more questions you answer, the more reason to have a mandatory policy in place would be. This includes what other control measures are available in place in your workplace as well too, and do those control measures minimize the risk of infection? And we'll start to look at some of those today as well too. Dorrit has just asked, I would like to know if this policy would, could or should apply to residents living in an aged care or retirement village as well too. With that, Dorrit, the aged care for residents living in aged care, I'd say I believe that aged care, there already is the vaccination policy for the residents living in aged care, as opposed to the staff, including volunteers, that may support that as well too. So with it, there's also the question of, would a requirement to be vaccinated be unlawful in these circumstances, and whether there is a potential discrimination against a class of employees. And we'll cover what those discrimination items could include as well too, and what you need to consider. So essentially one of the things, and we've looked at this really carefully, of the mandatory vaccination policy side and working through this with agencies. And this is a checklist that we actually use to essentially, I'm going to say, assess whether agencies should move to a vaccination policy. The other part that I will add to this as well too is generally a policy is not going to be enough. And what I mean by that is you also need to look at, well, how are you going to implement that policy as well too? So if you do have a policy and you do say, right, all people need to be vaccinated, well, what is that process? And we're going to look at, can you ask people for evidence that they've been vaccinated? Can you ask for documentation around if they have or haven't been vaccinated? And also, where do you store that information? And if they decide not to, what do you do about it as well too? So these are parts of the, and let me just go back, sorry, parts of the policy that often people forget. They think, oh, look, we'll just have a policy document and that'll be enough. We really need to go that one step further and go, well, what the hell does this look like? And I will say that because it is at times when agencies just get really confused and kind of throw their hands up and go, I have no idea what we're going to do around this as well too. Now, one of the things I mentioned right at the start, sorry, let's go back one, is what does the AHPP say about vaccinations in the industry? Now, you would think that essentially, and I'll just stop here for 1 second because I do want to jump onto this. Catherine has just asked, what about organisations that provide services to remote Indigenous communities, specifically elders? Catherine, in that case, I have taken and I'll say this quite openly, we have taken a very, very strong approach in that regard. We've actually had a mandatory policy. We've actually pushed that out to a lot of agencies providing remote services to Indigenous communities. I've actually recommended that not only do staff and volunteers have it, that if you work with contracting agencies as well too, our legal agreements have been drafted to include those people as well too. Specifically elders, there's actually an article in the Age newspaper that talks and references the limitations in terms of what has been achieved within the Indigenous communities across the country, and the need to protect vulnerable people as well too. For that reason, we've actually taken equally a very strong approach. We've done this for, I'd say, at least 12 months now, to say, no, if it's identified as a vulnerable population group, absolutely you need to take a pretty strong stance on it. And I dare say you'd meet all of those previous requirements that I've listed as well too. That said, the AH statements coming out of the AHPPC talk about, well, do they specifically give you an industry specific position? Now, I've taken an example of what one of their statements do say. And essentially it comes out to say employees, and this is an example, I've just literally cut and pasted this out, employees in sectors with high mobility, such as aviation, mining, freight transport, pose an increased risk of wide dispersion of infection across long distances and across jurisdictions. And then it essentially goes in and talks about the risks that these groups pose. However, what it then finishes up is their directions is, because of the risk of seeding of outbreaks across the country, the AHPPC strongly encourages industries to promote and facilitate vaccination. For me, looking at this, if I was looking at this and saying, well, is this an industry position? Having a position as strongly encourages doesn't actually tell me, well, it's a directive to say I must have all my staff vaccinated in these areas. So with it, sometimes as much as Safe Work might turn around to you and say, oh, question one is the AHPPC recommending COVID-19 vaccinations for all workers in your industry? When you actually do look at what sometimes what statements come out of the AHPPC, it's not very clear. So where does that then leave you? Essentially, what we look at is breaking down a series of questions around employers requiring, can you require an employee to provide evidence that they have been vaccinated? Now, let's step through this. And Lena has asked, do you have a draft of the vaccination policy? We do have a template, Lena, as well too, that we're going to make available to all agencies as well too. And it will cover off some of these questions that people need to answer to fill out what this looks like as well too. And of course, Lena, and a shout out to Lena from Women's Housing Limited, who has done incredible amount of work from a compliance point of view, which we will use as an example as well too, across their agency as well too. So with it, questions to ask, and we'll answer these next slides in question and answer type of format to give you an idea of the response. So can an employer require an employee to provide evidence that they have been vaccinated to start with? Well, if an employer like yourselves has provided a lawful and reasonable direction, and we will look at what this looks like, to be vaccinated, you can ask the employee to provide evidence of their vaccination. Now, where you want to direct an employee to provide evidence, you need to look at the requirement is lawful and also reasonable. Now, whether a direction is lawful and reasonable really depends on a series of circumstances. Now, those circumstances we will cover off of what are you actually trying to achieve here, and also ensuring that you meet the privacy obligations to holding this information. So if an employee refuses to be vaccinated, then essentially what we've said to agencies is the first step should be asking the employee to explain their reasons for refusing the vaccination. Now, they might provide a legitimate reason, and this is taken from Safe Work site. For example, they have a pre-existing medical condition. The employee and the employer and yourself should consider whether there are any options available instead of the vaccination itself. I will add that stand downs are unlikely to be an available option for employers if an employee refuses a direction to be vaccinated, because stand downs are only allowed in certain circumstances, and generally employers don't otherwise have the power to suspend employees without pay unless there is an enterprise or registered agreement or employment contract that allows you to do so. Now, if an employee refuses to be vaccinated, can you require evidence about why they have refused it? Now, if you have provided a reasonable direction to be vaccinated, essentially you can direct an employee to provide evidence of this. And essentially what that means is that if they provide evidence of a medical reason to be vaccinated, then again, you need to ensure that you meet your privacy obligations in how you actually store that and where that information is kept as well too. Now, the other question that people ask us is, well, can an employee refuse to attend the workplace because another co-worker isn't vaccinated against coronavirus? Now, firstly, this is assuming that there is no public health order preventing attendance. So, for example, this would exclude places like aged care services. This would exclude places like hotel quarantines, etc., around that. So if there's no public health order preventing attendance, it is unlikely that an employee could refuse to attend their workplace because another co-worker isn't vaccinated. And the reason for that is because vaccinations is not mandatory, and most workplaces won't require employees to be vaccinated at the previous time. And essentially, if the co-worker may have a legitimate reason not to be vaccinated, for example, they have a medical reason to do so. Now, I do have a case example on this that I can share with you. And Philip has just asked what happens after the 16th of September in aged care centres with stand downs. Great question, Philip. I thought someone was going to ask me that as well too. So essentially from the 16th, there is public health orders now and laws around this in aged care services. Now, the exception to this is that, and we've had this in a real life situation where their aged care services are looking at least giving people the first dose of the vaccine. There are some circumstances where people may be pregnant for a medical condition or for religious beliefs that they don't choose or they don't have the vaccine. We've had circumstances also where people that are pregnant have sought to have the vaccine, but have been directed by medical staff to not have it, even though it was their decision and they wanted to actually have it as well too. So there's a few case studies that we've seen in different agencies across the country where such circumstances have occurred. So essentially come the 16th of September around this, as you point out, where aged care services and people haven't had the vaccine, then essentially it is around a direction that has been provided under a public health order. That is different, and essentially you have the capacity to do it. Now, the conditions around this, Philip, as well too, that you would need to equally consider is, has the staff member had reasonable access to the vaccine? Do they have a legitimate reason for not having it as well too? So there are a few factors that do need to be considered in terms of taking this position. What we have said to agencies, to unpack Philip's question a bit more, is to not just wait until the cutoff date around it, but start to inform staff and work with staff if you can, and volunteers if you can. And when I say if you can, to start those conversations with people to say, we're going to work with you on this, but if you don't do this, then this is where the position is that we're going to lead to.
And that will give people reasonable time to actually look at either having it or to seek medical advice around it as well too, and what the position is from there. So essentially starting this conversation a lot earlier will give you the capacity to do it. I know in some agencies, Philip, where in the past few months, they've actually had I'll call it a survey that goes from staff members directly to, I'll say, the aged care manager, where people have actually completed a survey, and it's basically said, it's asked two questions. The first question is, have you had the vaccine, or are you intending to have it? And then they've had a question for a space for comments, because that allowed them to essentially run down their staffing list of working out exactly where they're sitting, essentially right across the whole service area, and addressing questions that people have around it as well too. The other one that we have just asked around from Michelle is, will you be sharing the webinar slides after today's presentation? Yes, Michelle, absolutely. We will be sharing all of these slides along with the recording of the presentation as well too. The other question is, can an employer take disciplinary action if an employee refuses to get vaccinated? So an employer may be able to take disciplinary action, and this picks up Philip's question, including termination of employment as well too, if the employee's refusal is in breach of a specific law or clear and repeated lawful and reasonable direction requiring vaccination as well too. It will depend on the individual facts and circumstances. So things like, you will need to look at enterprise agreements, awards, employment contracts, your workplace policies as well too, and public health orders. As directed under Safe Work as well too, agencies should consider legal advice around these circumstances. And I will say part of this session is to give you some general items to consider as well too, but certainly you can reach out back to us around this as well too. Now, other questions that come up is, how does a vaccination requirement interact with anti-discrimination laws as well? And I said to you at the start of this session, when we talk of COVID, HR, workplace rules and vaccination laws, there is this crossover between Fair Work, awards, public health orders, privacy, and now we're going to throw at you anti-discrimination laws as well too. So it is important that agencies like yourselves consider your obligations and responsibilities under anti-discrimination laws as well. These laws prohibit discrimination against employees in your workplace based on protected characteristics. Now, these protected characteristics that are likely to be relevant in considering whether to require vaccination include disability, pregnancy, or religious beliefs as well too. And essentially, Safe Work have requested that before requesting or requiring employees to be vaccinated, your agency should consider any Commonwealth, state, or territory discrimination laws, including Fair Work laws as well too. Now, let me summarize this down for you really simply. Essentially, people with a disability, a medical condition, pregnancy, or if they're pregnant, or have religious beliefs that stop them from having the COVID vaccine, it will be difficult to, I'm going to say, require them to have it as well too. So policies need to be in place to support those people with these protected characteristics. Now, that said, there are a number of agency staff that we know that we've worked with around this as well too, that have had one of these protected characteristics, that have actually decided of their own accord to actually have a vaccine. So it is not that just because you have one of these protected characteristics that you do not have it. It may well be that you need to consider people that may be in these or be covered by these positions as well too. Now, going back a number of months ago, what we did say to agencies, and this picks up Philip's questions, Catherine's questions, as as well as Dorot's questions as well too, of which of the groups and why we made the position of having a mandatory vaccination policy focused on certain groups. Essentially, and also Kimberly's question as well too, and Kimberly raised, would these examples refer to volunteers as well as paid employees? So essentially, one of the big areas that has been identified by the Australian Technical Advisory Group on Immunisation was identifying vulnerable members of our Australian community, and they list them. So this included health and aged care workers, other care workers, including disability support workers, people in settings where the risk of the virus transmission is increased, and they, going back many months ago, actually included quarantine workers. And this was before the states and Commonwealth governments issued different public health orders. And with that, they also identified vulnerable population groups, such as Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, older people, and people with selected medical conditions. Now, what we have said to agencies is when looking at your agency and deciding whether to have a mandatory vaccination policy, actually look at, does your agency provide services to one or more of these groups? Because if it does, then you have an obligation under work health and safety guidelines to make sure, or work health and safety laws, to make sure that you take reasonable steps to ensure that your workplace is not only safe, but also the services that you deliver to your clients are also safe as well too. So essentially, if your group, service groups fits into one of these population groups, then there is a good case to actually have a mandatory policy in place to make sure that you do meet the requirements as well. Now, the other part that we have to cover as part of the HR process is attestation registers. And this is something great. And I will also just jump in here. Jadrandra has just asked, during recruitment process, can you ask the question of, are you vaccinated? Absolutely, you can, Jadrandra. That's certainly the case that agencies can do that as well too. And you can certainly ask that question. And we've seen it on the Work Health and Safety website, Safe Work website as well too. The other part that, in terms of ensuring that your agency is taking its reasonable steps, is to look at attestation registers. And this is something, to go back to Philip's question, something that aged care services and also other agencies have been directed in Victoria to actually do. So essentially, the daily attestation register is being used by agencies to ensure that staff complete essentially what I call a daily statutory declaration to say that they don't have any COVID symptoms. Now, what this essentially looks like is when you log in to your Gemba dashboard, what you will see is a daily attestation form. And let me just bring what one looks like around this. And the daily attestation record, and we will log in, which I do thank Rumbalara Aboriginal Cooperative around this, has essentially logged in. And to show you what one looks like, if I open this up, what they have is a daily attestation form, and I'll just bring this up. You'll see it on the left-hand side of the screen. And essentially, when you click on it, what it brings up is the date and the time of the form. It then asks you a series of questions. So, have you had the COVID test within the last week? Have you had any of the following symptoms as well too? And when staff complete this, essentially they're making sure that none of their staff are actually presenting with any of their COVID symptoms. And the daily attestation form is a mandatory requirement issued by in Victoria by the Victorian state government around this, and it requires you to, in fact, they'll get key staff to complete these forms as part of their daily assessment work that they need to do. And you will find that essentially once you have these and access the Gemba dashboard, you'll be able to view these forms for yourselves as well. Now, the other questions that people have asked around this, and I think Dorrit has just come up and said, although listed as a retirement village, our residents are living independently, and the concern is that some residents do not want the vaccine, and we want to make sure we are fulfilling our legal requirements and that the mandated industries such as aged care are in fact met. That's a really good question around that, Dorrit. And we're finding that even agencies, and I'll compare this with the one of the migrant resource centres, the Southern Migrant Resource Centre raised the question with Patricia Matthews, who's the HR and compliance officer out there as well, who actually has set up things like what we call those daily attestation forms, and essentially are asking their workers to actually complete those each day. And what it's done is actually screen people to make sure that they do not have any symptoms as part of that process. In your case, what we'd recommend, and look at this, and more than happy to have a phone call after today's webinar, is around essentially looking at identifying who has had the vaccine and who hasn't, in order to meet your work health and safety obligations as well too. Duranda's just asked another question in terms of our business has labour hire. Of recent times, we are getting requests from companies looking for labour hire staff saying that the potential staff need to be vaccinated. How do you suggest we manage this as they're not part of the mandated industries such as aged care? It's an interesting question. Thank you for that. We have already started receiving questions from agencies, and let me just answer this in two ways, Duranda. Essentially, we've had agencies that do work in mandated industries such as aged care, disability, or brokerage type of services, where people have started to, where they've got clients that have said, we only want staff that are vaccinated to come and see us. So essentially, you've got these two groups that are essentially asking for either clients, but you've also got to look at, well, how do we manage our staff positions? What we are going to look at as part of this with the attestation registers, and I will just mention Rumbalara Aboriginal Cooperative, and thank Laurie Seville out there, the Chief Operating Officer, who we've just referred to their dashboard, and also Women's Housing, Judy Line, who's the Chief Executive Officer, and Lena Tompkinson, the Executive Assistant and Compliance Officer, who've already started doing things like, and I'll just cover this off, looking at things like ensuring that their staff complete their attestation forms as part of those screenings. So essentially, for people that aren't actually in that vaccination group, and I'm not saying that these aren't, but irrespective of whether they have or they haven't had it, they're actually asking staff to complete either daily or weekly in women's housing case, and I'll come to women's housing in a minute. Essentially, Rumbalara are actually getting people to do their screening every single day. So they've got about 200 or 300 odd staff, irrespective of whether they're working from home or they're on site. People screen every single day around it, and they can actually check to see if anybody's got any of their COVID symptoms. Now, to date, they've had nobody in the community, and that's after they've set up their COVID testing site from last weekend. They've had about 1,000 members go through in the first few days of their COVID testing, which is an incredible amount of traffic coming through in one community. All their staff are in fact screened. So Duranda, there's the potential to allow your agency to in fact use an assessment tool that staff, while they're on site, are completing what we call that daily attestation form that they're submitting, that they don't have any symptoms around that as well too. We're seeing that also with Women's Housing Limited as well too, but they're slightly different, where they do it, I believe, and Lena might add in on this to this conversation as well too. I know she's joined us today, was that they do that weekly, and they do that weekly dependent on when staff are actually getting out, because the risk is in fact different, and their staff are not at risk dependent on their movements that they have based in Victoria. So you can see that essentially there are two different ways. Great. Thanks, Lena. Lena's just commented to say staff only complete when attending office or women's housing site properties. So essentially, what you're seeing there is that when people are actually attending it, and that geranda can also work for yourselves. I'll say women's housing with managed and under the compliance eye of Lena has allowed them to view when staff are actually visiting the site and complete those forms as well too. And it's essentially a screening form that allow people to actually do it. So the practical implications of this is that even if you don't have all of your staff vaccinated, you can still run this screening process, which allows you to get your eyes across potential staff that might be exposed to risks and the likes. I will add that since February last year, Rumballara have got their staff to do this literally, I think, since about February or March last year, and they've got somewhere in excess of about 30 or 40,000 forms over the 15, 12 months that they can actually go back through and actually check for work health and safety audit purposes as well. I will add that next week's session, we are going to look at the HR workflows. We're going to look at policies, forms. We're going to look at also if you do need to obviously manage your staff vaccinations. What does that look like? How do you store information? And I can see that people are asking questions around storing of vaccine information and questionnaires that they want to ask as well too to get staff completed. We will open up the looking at workflows on staff forms, survey forms of what you need to look at on your Gemba dashboard and what is the process for that. Looking at having staff complete their own information, looking at questions that might come up and managing discriminative issues. For example, people managing people that have protected characteristics, like those that are pregnant, have a disability, are a vulnerable population as well too, and also under religious beliefs, and how do you manage all of that information and meet all of your privacy requirements from a HR point of view as well too, and really operationalize some of our legal areas that we have covered off today. I will say to jump into your Gemba dashboard because these tools will be loaded there as well. Bridie has just asked another question in terms of, as overseas examples attest, you can still transmit the virus even if you are vaccinated. And in fact, staff might be contagious but have no symptoms, which is highly problematic, as will make the daily attestation less useful. Should policy look at rapid antigen tests, which now have been approved by TGA? There are options around that, Bridie, as well too. What we are looking at here is what is the, I'm going to say, where is the line in the sand for agencies? So when we look at a lot of the questions that have been asked today around this, anything further that we need to look at, where do we in fact go? What in addition do we need to do it? And I know that people have been starting to look at rapid antigen tests as well too. I will add that Rumballara Aboriginal Co-op actually has had on site a point of care testing device that had been used as well too, and now they're working with a pathology company as well too to essentially work through this as well too. So essentially and that is a great segue, Bridie, to the recommendations coming out of today. What we have said is review the COVIDSafe policies to address the legal issues addressed today and unpack these as well too. Essentially, looking at the discussion on vaccination policy for your agency. Does it fit into one of those areas? And consider the HR vaccination registers as well too. And we will give you the login details around this stuff as well. If you do have any questions, by all means, reach out to us on our 1300 number. My mobile number is also available as well too. And you can reach us at our support desk emails as well too, coming out of the webinar. I will add, and I will stay on the line and answer any questions that people might have to make sure that they are all answered before we finish up today. But if you do have questions and you think, oh my goodness, we do want to ask some further questions, reach out to us on this email. We will send all of this information out to you today. Next week, we are looking at implementing the HR COVIDSafe workplace forms.
We're going to be using a case study of an agency that we have worked with around this to look at survey questions, what forms, what policies, what vaccine registers, and actually work through a complete flow chart. We didn't have the time to do it in one session today, but we will be looking at how the workflow of this works and what your agency needs to do to in fact step this through and consider as part of this process as well. If you do have any questions, by all means, please bounce these into the question panel. We will also open up the phone lines. If you are listening and watching this webinar via our recording and you do want to reach back out to us with any of the materials, be that the slides, be that the Gemba dashboard access and the likes, you can reach out to us on 1300 360 360 or email us at support@gemba360.com.